My name is Julia Resciniti, and this is my name sign. I was diagnosed with hearing loss when I was 3 years old, and I identify both as little d deaf and disabled. I became intimately familiar with the process of requesting accommodations through the course of attending mainstream public school. Now, when you saw a presentation titled Putting Disability at the Forefront of Innovation, you probably had some assumptions about what each of these words mean. I am giving this presentation at the Rochester Institute of Technology, which is on the cutting edge of animation, virtual reality, and maker spaces. This is not the type of innovation that I would like to talk about today. Instead, I would like to talk about who innovation is for and who is making it. I would like you all to join me in a scenario. You've woken up, maybe 15 minutes before your alarm, and there's a person or a pet laying in the bed next to you as you decide that you want to stay awake and you want to scroll your social media app of preference. And as you do so, you put your phone on mute so as not to disturb anyone else. And the reason you can do this is because there are captions on most of the videos. When you eventually decide that you do want to get out of bed and you want to run errands, you bring a little wagon with you so that you can tow your groceries back home. And as you go outside, there's a curb. And when you pull your wagon up, there's a little ramp for you to do that. That's called a curb cut. When you eventually decide that you want to cross the street, you press a button to do that as well. And if you get distracted and you look away, there's a voice that barks "walk" for you to cross. And so you cross. And now, in this scenario, regardless of whether or not you have a disability, you have utilized 3 accommodations. Now, we don't often think of these types of accommodations as innovations, but they absolutely are. Curb cuts first appeared in 1945, but were not legally mandated until the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, in 1990. Closed captions were not legally mandated in television or film until 2006. Walk signals, accessible to the blind, so that voice, was not legally mandated in court until 2007. Now, you might notice that I'm framing each of these in terms of when they were legally mandated, which isn't the typical way that you frame innovation. And this is because the passage of the ADA in 1990 reshaped our built world. Anytime you use an elevator or a button to automatically open a door, or even widened hallways, you are using infrastructure and innovations that were put into this world to comply with the ADA. So the ADA is great because it pushed all of these innovations into our everyday life to accommodate disabled Americans. But there are still substantial critiques of the ADA. Namely, that it requires a disabled person to face a barrier and then file a complaint, or in some cases, a lawsuit. This is because the wording of the ADA requires reasonable accommodation from public agencies or government agencies. Now, what reasonable means is vague and often undefined. So, to define what it means, you have to go to court, where it will be argued by lawyers and decided by judges. When we look at who is making these decisions, we see that by and large, it is not disabled people themselves. Of lawyers working in law firms, only 1.4% identify as having a disability, and we do not collect data on the number of judges that identify as having a disability. So this means disabled people are not the ones making these choices. But it could be tempting to argue, well, 1.4%, how many disabled people are there? Maybe that's proportional representation. It's not. The current estimate is that 1 in 4, or 25% of Americans, have a disability. So it's not proportional representation, but how many cases are filed under the ADA every year? When we look at the civil docket, so that's all non-criminal cases, the civil docket, we see that 4% are related to the ADA. If we look at civil rights cases, it's higher at 27%. So we see that disabled people are not proportionally represented in the legal field. Now, the legal field by itself isn't innovation, but it does shape what innovation is required and who can participate in making it. I want to shift to a more obvious field of innovation, medicine. Dr. Lisa Meeks is a scholar who studies medical study, research, and practice. She argues that to make medicine inclusive to disabled people, we would have to fundamentally reshape it. She argues that currently the way that we conceptualize inclusion is based on fairness. Fairness, as we currently define it, means equality. Everyone has access to the same resources. However, this assumes that everyone has the same needs. This is not true within a disability framework. Now, Dr. Lisa Meeks argues that we need to build from a starting point of inclusion through universal design. Universal design is the way that we conceptualize most of our modern understanding of accommodation. The Center for Excellence in Universal Design defines it as the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. Dr. Lisa Meeks is an advocate for implementing more universal design. However, one of the problems with medicine is that it has a high burnout rate. This is true regardless of ability or disability. Nurses are regularly expected to work upwards of 10 hours. They are discouraged from taking breaks, and they can often be discouraged from basic rest, like sitting. When you apply these same standards, which can be harmful to non-disabled people, you find that they exacerbate symptoms for disabled people, particularly things like disrupted sleep schedule. So, when you look at nursing, they already have a framework to combat burnout. It's called resilience. Resilience is a system of managing stress and accessing resources available to you. For non-disabled students, this may mean counseling. For disabled students, it means accommodations. But, as we discussed when we talked about the legal framework, there are barriers to accessing accommodations. There is stigma attached to requesting accommodations. You may be labeled as incompetent if you do so. You may be barred from certain lab work or clinical rotations. If you do request accommodations and the medical school denies your request, there is limited recourse. As we discussed, you'd have to file a lawsuit, and that doesn't always work. When we consider these hostile factors in medicine, is it any surprise that disabled doctors are also underrepresented? Keeping in mind that 25% of Americans have a disability, it should be distressing when we find that only 3% of doctors report having a disability. The impacts of this extend far from just excluding disabled people from respective professional careers. It extends to patients as well. There was a survey that went out to doctors that asked if they felt they would be able to provide equitable care to their disabled patients. Only 40.7% of them responded that they would feel comfortable providing equal care. This is less than half of doctors that felt comfortable providing equal care to their disabled patients. Medicine is not the only field that has to contend with structural barriers to disabled people. Architecture has to contend with barriers in a more physical and literal sense than either law or medicine. A growing portion of Americans are over the age of 60. Growing old carries with it issues related to mobility. So, as our families grow older, we discover that our housing is not built with mobility issues in mind. There's also a framework to contend with this fact. It's called age-friendly architecture. This framework operates on 5 principles. First, accessibility. This is what we've been discussing this entire time. So, wheelchair access, shower chairs, moving appliances at sitting height. Second, adaptability. Not everyone has the same needs on the same day or the same week. So your homes need to be able to change to adapt this. Maybe you have a room on the first floor of your house that changes from being an exercise room to being a bedroom based on needs. Third, safety. So, implementing measures like fall protection, softer floors, automatic lighting. Fourth, social support. Designing spaces that are easy to access for socialization. And fifth, sensory support. So, natural lighting. And when we look at this framework, it is a kind, thoughtful, and compassionate way to build our housing. But there's no reason that it only needs to relate to age. Younger Americans also need homes with wheelchair access. Disabled Americans are more likely to experience isolation and would benefit from homes built with their socialization in mind. Age-friendly architecture is just universal design by another name. It's trying to achieve all of these same goals. Universal design looks at who the world is built for and why. And when we implement these principles, we get things like telehealth that allow immunocompromised people to see doctors in times of a global pandemic. If we applied it to nursing, you would get genuine labor wins. You would get a nursing field that is kinder to everyone. We have assumptions about who should exist in our built world. The same forces that can render disability invisible can also render universal design invisible, because you do not typically notice when you do not face barriers. Except disabled people notice, because we have been facing barriers our entire lives. We are used to a world that is not built for us. But we notice when we face barriers, and we notice when we do not. So this is what I mean when I say putting disability at the forefront of innovation. I mean putting disabled people in a place where we can make decisions for and about our lived realities. When you allow disabled people to play a role in designing our built world, you get things like curb cuts that non-disabled parents can use to push strollers up ramps. You get elevators, you get widened hallways, you get adjustable desks. You get a world that, more than just being compassionate to our aging families, is easier and kinder to live in. So rather than framing innovation as something cool or exciting, I would like to see innovation as something that is kind and something that makes our world easier to live in. So thank you for coming. Thank you to our interpreters. And please, hire disabled professionals.